Have you ever looked at an old family photograph and noticed something that just didn't feel right? Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling discoveries ever made in a century-old portrait. A seemingly innocent family photo from 1910 hides a detail so disturbing that it has left historians, paranormal investigators, and everyday people completely baffled. The question isn't just what we're seeing, it's whether we should believe our own eyes. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And before we begin, I'm also developing another channel with even more mysterious content, so stay tuned for updates on that. Let's uncover the truth behind the hand that shouldn't exist. Margaret Chen's hands trembled as she carefully removed the portrait from the attic box. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the small window, giving the moment an almost dreamlike quality. She had been sorting through her late grandmother's belongings for 3 weeks now, and this particular box had been pushed to the furthest corner of the Connecticut estate's attic, buried beneath decades of forgotten memories. The photograph was mounted in an ornate silver frame, tarnished with age, but still elegant. The image showed a family of 4, posed in what appeared to be a photographer's studio. Margaret recognized the style immediately, early 1900s, probably around 1910, based on the clothing and backdrop. A well-dressed couple sat in the center, the woman in a high-collared white blouse with intricate lace detail, the man in a dark suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. 2 children, a boy and a girl, who looked to be around 8 and 10 years old, stood on either side of their parents. At first glance, it was a perfect portrait of American prosperity from the Gilded Age. The family's expressions were serious, as was customary for photographs of that era, but there was something in their eyes that suggested contentment, pride even. The studio backdrop featured painted columns and draped fabric, creating an illusion of wealth and sophistication. Margaret set the frame on the workbench she'd set up and pulled her phone from her pocket to capture an image for her own records. Through her phone's camera, she zoomed in on different sections of the photograph, documenting the details. That's when she saw it. The mother's left hand rested on her daughter's shoulder, but as Margaret zoomed closer, her breath caught in her throat. The hand was wrong, completely undeniably wrong. It was too large, the fingers too long and masculine. The skin tone didn't match the woman's visible right hand, which rested delicately in her lap. More disturbing still, the angle was impossible. The hand appeared to be reaching from behind the woman, yet no one stood behind her in the portrait. Margaret's heart pounded as she set down her phone and examined the physical photograph directly. She'd worked as a photo restoration specialist for 12 years. She knew every trick of early photography, every common defect and double exposure error. This wasn't that. The hand was in perfect focus, printed with the same clarity as the rest of the image. It cast the appropriate shadow on the daughter's shoulder. It was as real as every other element in the portrait, and yet it shouldn't exist. She pulled out a magnifying glass from her toolkit and studied every millimeter of the photograph. No signs of manipulation, no evidence of retouching or overlay. The photographic paper itself was authentic to the period, complete with the photographer's embossed mark in the bottom corner. Blackwood Studios, Hartford, CT, 1910. Margaret photographed the portrait from every angle, capturing the impossible hand in high resolution. She then carefully turned the frame over and removed the backing. Perhaps there would be some notation, some explanation written on the reverse of the photograph. Instead, she found only a single line of text in faded ink. The Morrison family, October 1910. May God protect them. The phrase sent a chill down her spine. Not God bless them or God be with them, but protect them. As if whoever had written those words knew the family needed protection from something. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me bring you more content like this. Margaret took the portrait downstairs to her grandmother's study, which she'd been using as a base of operations. She spread out the genealogy documents she'd already found, looking for any mention of the Morrison family. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Morrison, which meant these people were her ancestors. But strangely, this particular branch of the family tree seemed to have very little documentation beyond 1910. She found a marriage certificate for Thomas Morrison and Eleanor Hartfield, dated 1899. Birth certificates for the children: James, born 1900, and Catherine, born 1902. And then nothing. No death certificates, no further records, no census data after 1910. It was as if the entire family had simply vanished from historical record. Margaret opened her laptop and began searching genealogy databases, census records, newspaper archives, anything that might explain the gap. The Hartford Public Library's digital archives showed Blackwood Studios had been one of the city's premier photography establishments, operated by Samuel Blackwood from 1895 until 1912, when he'd abruptly closed the business and left Connecticut. No explanation was ever given. As evening shadows lengthened across the study, Margaret continued her search. She found a brief mention in a Hartford newspaper from November 1910, just 1 month after the photograph was taken. The headline read, "Morrison family departs Hartford under mysterious circumstances." The article was frustratingly vague, mentioning only that Thomas Morrison had sold his successful textile business with great haste and that the family had left town. No destination was provided. Margaret stared at the photograph again, at that impossible hand resting on young Catherine's shoulder. In the fading light, the image seemed almost three-dimensional, the hand appearing to press more firmly against the girl's dress. She shook her head, dismissing the illusion as a trick of shadows. But when she looked at the daughter's face more closely, she noticed something she'd missed before. While the rest of the family maintained the stoic expressions typical of the era, Catherine's eyes held something different. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resignation, an awareness that seemed far too mature for a child of 8. Margaret made a decision. She would find out what happened to this family and discover the truth behind the hand that couldn't exist. The next morning, Margaret drove into Hartford with the photograph carefully secured in an archival sleeve. Her first stop was the Connecticut Historical Society, where she'd made an appointment with Dr. Raymond Fletcher, a specialist in early 20th century photography and local history. Dr. Fletcher was a man in his 70s with silver hair and sharp eyes that immediately focused on the photograph as Margaret laid it on his examination table. He pulled on white cotton gloves and picked up a loupe, studying the image in silence for several long minutes. "Extraordinary," he finally murmured. "The preservation is remarkable. And this hand..." He trailed off, moving the loupe slowly across the surface. "I've seen thousands of photographs from this era, Miss Chen. Thousands. I've seen double exposures, chemical defects, damaged plates, intentional manipulations. This is none of those things." "So what is it?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Fletcher set down the loupe and removed his gloves. "I knew Samuel Blackwood's work well. He was a perfectionist, obsessed with technical precision. He would never have released a flawed photograph, especially not one commissioned by a prominent family like the Morrisons. Thomas Morrison owned Morrison Textiles, one of the largest employers in Hartford at the time. He walked to his desk and returned with a leather-bound ledger. "I've been cataloging Blackwood's surviving records for years." He kept meticulous notes on every sitting. He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. Here, Morrison family, October 15th, 1910. "But look at this notation." Margaret leaned in to read the cramped handwriting. "Third attempt, previous plates destroyed. Family insists on final product despite irregularity. Payment received, studio copy made. May God forgive me." "He took 3 photographs?" Margaret asked. "Apparently, and destroyed the first 2 plates. The question is, why?" Dr. Fletcher returned to the photograph, and this phrase, "despite irregularity." "I believe he's referring to this hand." "So he saw it too," Margaret said slowly. "It wasn't added later. It was in the original photograph. It would appear so. Which presents us with a fascinating problem. This hand is photographically authentic to the moment the picture was taken, but it cannot physically exist in the way we're seeing it. Leave a comment below about what you think is happening in this story so far." Dr. Fletcher showed Margaret additional records he'd found. Samuel Blackwood had been born in 1865 in London and immigrated to America in 1890. He'd established himself quickly as a photographer of exceptional skill, working primarily with Hartford's elite families. But according to the records, he'd become increasingly troubled in the months following the Morrison sitting. He wrote letters to colleagues expressing distress about certain photographs, Dr. Fletcher explained, showing Margaret photocopies of correspondence. He mentioned presences appearing in his portraits, images that shouldn't be there. Some of his peers thought he was experiencing a mental breakdown. Others suggested he was involved in spiritualism, which was quite popular at the time. Margaret examined one of the letters, dated January 1911. Blackwood wrote, "I can no longer practice my craft with confidence. What my camera captures is not always what my eyes perceive. I fear I have become an unwitting medium, recording not only the physical world, but something that exists adjacent to it." "What happened to him?" Margaret asked. "He closed his studio in March 1912 and moved to Massachusetts. He died in 1915, age 50, of what his death certificate listed as melancholia. Today, we might call it severe depression." Dr. Fletcher paused. "But here's what's truly interesting. After his death, his widow donated his remaining studio materials to the Hartford Historical Society. Among those materials was a journal. Most of it is routine business records, but there are several entries about the Morrison sitting." He retrieved another document from his files and handed it to Margaret. The entry was dated October 20th, 1910, 5 days after the Morrison photograph. "I cannot shake the image from my mind," Blackwood had written. "The family saw nothing unusual during the sitting. Mr. Morrison was pleased with the composition, but when I developed the plate, there it was, the hand that reaches from nowhere. I showed Mrs. Morrison, and her face went white as snow. She asked me to destroy the plate immediately. When I prepared to do so, Mr. Morrison stopped me. He said, and I quote, 'It's already too late to pretend. We live with it. We might as well have proof.' I have never felt such dread in my studio." Margaret's hands shook slightly as she read. "Did Blackwood explain what he thought the hand was?" "He never stated it explicitly, but his later writings suggest he believed he was photographing something supernatural, spirits, ghosts, call them what you will. Whether that's what this actually is." Dr. Fletcher shrugged. "I'm a historian, not a paranormal investigator. What I can tell you is that the photograph is authentic and unmanipulated, and that multiple witnesses at the time found it deeply disturbing." Margaret spent the rest of the morning in the Historical Society's archives, searching for more information about the Morrison family. She found newspaper clippings about Thomas Morrison's textile business, society page mentions of Eleanor Morrison's charity work, even a brief article about young James Morrison winning a mathematics prize at his school. But everything stopped in October 1910. The last mention of the family was dated November 3rd. The residence of Thomas Morrison on Asylum Avenue has been sold to Mr. Philip Hendricks of New York. The Morrison family has departed Hartford for undisclosed reasons, leaving many business obligations unresolved. That final detail troubled Margaret. Thomas Morrison had been, by all accounts, a responsible businessman and pillar of the community. Why would he leave so abruptly that he abandoned business obligations? She found the address of the former Morrison residence and decided to visit the location. The drive took only 20 minutes. When she arrived, she was surprised to find the house still standing, a grand Victorian mansion now converted into professional offices. She parked and walked up the front steps, noting the ornate woodwork and stained glass windows that had survived more than a century. A small brass plaque by the door listed the current tenants. Margaret copied down the information and was about to leave when she noticed an elderly man standing by the side of the house, pruning roses in what had once been a formal garden. "Excuse me," she called out. "Do you know anything about the history of this house?" The man straightened, regarding her with faded blue eyes. "I've been the caretaker here for 40 years, he said in a gravelly voice. "What would you like to know?" Margaret introduced herself and explained her research. The man, who identified himself as Ernest Webb, invited her to sit on a garden bench. "The Morrison house," he said thoughtfully. "Yes, I know the stories. Been hearing them since I was a boy. My grandfather worked for the family that bought the house in 1910. He told me things." "What kind of things?" Ernest looked at the mansion, his expression unreadable. "The family that bought it, the Hendricks, they only lasted 3 years before they sold it again. And the family after that, just 5 years. This house changed hands 7 times between 1910 and 1950. People said it was haunted, though I never seen anything myself." "Haunted by what?" "By whatever the Morrisons brought with them, or brought out, or however you want to understand it. My grandfather said Mrs. Morrison had been practicing spiritualism, seances, automatic writing, trying to contact her dead sister, said she opened a door she couldn't close." That evening, Margaret couldn't shake Ernest Webb's words from her mind. She'd returned to her grandmother's house with a new direction for her research: spiritualism in early 20th century Hartford. The spiritualist movement had peaked in America between 1840 and 1920, with millions of people, including many educated, wealthy individuals, believing they could communicate with the dead. Hartford had been home to several spiritualist societies and numerous mediums who offered seances to grieving families. Margaret searched online archives and found references to a Hartford spiritualist society that had been active from 1895 to 1915. The society's membership lists had been preserved, and there, dated from 1907 to 1910, was Eleanor Morrison's name. More digging revealed that Eleanor's younger sister Margaret, her own namesake, Margaret realized with a chill, had died in 1906 at age 23 from tuberculosis. According to newspaper accounts, Eleanor had been devastated by the loss and had become consumed with attempting to contact her sister's spirit. Margaret found a ledger from a medium named Constance Fairchild, who had conducted private seances in Hartford from 1900 to 1912. The ledger, digitized by a local university, listed Eleanor Morrison as a regular client, with sessions conducted monthly from January 1907 through September 1910. The final entry, dated September 28, 1910, just 2 weeks before the photograph, included an unusual notation. "Session ended prematurely. Client disturbed by manifestation. Physical contact reported. Advise cessation of all spiritualist activities. Client refused counsel. Physical contact. A hand reaching from nowhere." Margaret's research led her to Cornell University's library, which housed one of the most comprehensive collections of spiritualist materials in the country. She spent the next 2 days there, combing through correspondence, seance records, and journals from the period. If you're finding this investigation compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything. She discovered that Constance Fairchild had been a respected medium who eventually became skeptical of her own practices. In a letter dated 1913, written to a colleague after she'd retired from seance work, Fairchild described her final session with Eleanor Morrison. "I have conducted hundreds of seances in my years of practice, and I have always believed that I was genuinely facilitating communication between this world and the next. But that September evening changed everything. Mrs. Morrison came to me in great distress, begging me to help her sever a connection that had formed with something claiming to be her sister. She said the presence had been appearing to her daughter, standing behind the child, placing its hand on her shoulder. The girl was terrified, but the parents had hidden this from their son and from society. During our session, I attempted to banish the presence, but instead, I felt it manifest in the room with us. The temperature dropped precipitously. And then I saw it, or rather I saw its hand, materializing in the air, reaching toward Mrs. Morrison. We both saw it clearly. It was not her sister. It was something else, something that had been masquerading as her sister. I told Mrs. Morrison to cease all spiritualist activities immediately, but she said it was too late, that the presence had already attached itself to her family. I never heard from her again. Margaret photographed the letter with shaking hands. This was it, the explanation that had been hidden for more than a century. Eleanor Morrison had unwittingly opened a doorway through her grief, and something had come through. Something that appeared in their family photograph, its hand visible to the camera, but perhaps not to all human eyes. But was it real? Or was this elaborate story simply the product of early 20th century superstition and the power of suggestion? Margaret continued her research into the night, finding more pieces of the puzzle. She discovered that Catherine Morrison, the daughter who had been touched by the mysterious hand, had left a brief memoir that was preserved in a private family collection. Through the help of a genealogy forum, Margaret was able to contact a descendant who shared scanned pages of the memoir. Catherine had written it in 1965, shortly before her death at age 63. The relevant passage made Margaret's blood run cold. I was 8 years old when it began. Mother had been visiting the medium for years, trying to reach Aunt Margaret. I thought nothing of it until one night. I woke to find a woman standing at the foot of my bed. She looked like the photographs I'd seen of Aunt Margaret, but her eyes were wrong. Empty, dark, like wells with no bottom. She told me she was lonely and needed someone to be with her. After that night, she came often. She would stand behind me, and I could feel her hand on my shoulder, cold and heavy. I told Mother and Father, but they didn't believe me until Father hired a photographer to document the family. When the photograph was developed, there it was, her hand on my shoulder, visible to everyone. Mother screamed when she saw it. We left Hartford the next week and never spoke of it again. But she followed us. She has always followed us. I feel her still, even now after all these years, her hand on my shoulder claiming me as hers. Margaret set down her phone, the memoir's words echoing in her mind. Catherine had lived another 55 years after that photograph was taken, always feeling that presence, that hand on her shoulder. The memoir confirmed that the family had seen the hand in the photograph and that it represented something Catherine had been experiencing in her daily life. But could a grief-stricken child's hallucinations manifest in a photograph? Was this a case of mass hysteria, of multiple people convincing themselves they saw something that wasn't there? Or had the camera captured something that existed outside normal human perception? Margaret returned to her grandmother's attic, needing to see the photograph again. As she climbed the narrow stairs, she noticed how cold the air had become. She pulled her jacket tighter and retrieved the portrait from where she'd stored it. In the dim light of a single bulb, she examined the photograph once more. The hand seemed more prominent now, more solid, as if it had gained substance since she'd first discovered it. But that was impossible. The photograph couldn't change, could it? She took a new photograph with her phone and compared it to the one she'd taken 2 days earlier. The hand looked identical. Her mind was playing tricks on her, making her see changes where none existed. Margaret was about to return downstairs when she noticed another box she'd overlooked before, tucked behind the chimney. She pulled it out and opened it, finding more family papers. Among them was a letter yellowed with age, addressed to her grandmother from Catherine Morrison. The letter was dated 1970, 5 years after Catherine's death. Margaret's heart raced as she realized this was impossible. She checked the envelope again. The postmark clearly showed 1970, but the letter inside was written in the same handwriting as Catherine's memoir from 1965. She read the letter with trembling hands. "Dear cousin, I write to you from beyond, though I know you will think me mad. The hand that claimed me in life has claimed me in death. I am not at rest. I am with her, whoever or whatever she truly is. She collects us, those who are touched in photographs, preserved in moments of time. We exist in the spaces between life and death, visible only to those who know how to look. Destroy the photograph. Do not let it claim anyone else. The hand reaches through time itself. Do not look too closely, or it may reach for you. Margaret dropped the letter as if it had burned her. This had to be a hoax, an elaborate prank. Letters didn't arrive from dead people, but the postmark was genuine, the envelope authentic to the period, the handwriting matched perfectly. She looked at the photograph again, and this time she saw something she'd somehow missed before. Behind the Morrison family, in the painted backdrop, there was a shadow that didn't match any of the visible figures. A shadow in the shape of a person, standing in a position that would place them directly behind the mother. And in that shadow, if she looked very carefully, she could see the faint outline of a face, a woman's face with dark, empty eyes. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her grandmother's study, surrounded by documents, photographs, and letters, trying to make sense of what she'd uncovered. The rational part of her mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. The other part, the part that had seen Catherine's impossible letter, wasn't so sure. At dawn, she made coffee and returned to her research with renewed focus. If Catherine's letter was genuine, if the phenomenon was real, then perhaps there were other cases. Other photographs with impossible elements, other families touched by whatever entity had claimed the Morrisons. She began searching museum databases, paranormal archives, and photography collections for similar cases. What she found astonished her. In the Metropolitan Museum's collection, there was an 1895 portrait of the Whitmore family from Boston, showing what the catalogue diplomatically called an unexplained photographic anomaly, a pair of hands resting on a young boy's shoulders, hands that belonged to no one in the frame. In a private collection in Philadelphia, a daguerreotype from 1888 showed the Keller family of Pennsylvania. Museum notes indicated that viewers often reported seeing an additional figure in the background that wasn't visible in reproductions, only in the original photograph. The Chicago History Museum had a series of photographs from 1902 documenting the Ashford family, including one portrait where, according to restoration notes, an hand of indeterminate origin appears to grasp the eldest daughter's wrist. Margaret created a spreadsheet documenting each case she found. By noon, she had identified 17 photographs spanning from 1870 to 1920, all showing similar anomalies, hands, faces, or shadowy figures that didn't belong. In every case where she could trace family history, the subjects had experienced some connection to spiritualism or had recently lost a family member. More disturbing still, in the cases where she could find information about the subjects' later lives, there was a pattern: premature deaths, unexplained disappearances, or reports of lifelong mental disturbances. The subjects in these photographs, particularly children, seemed to suffer disproportionately high rates of tragedy. Catherine Morrison had lived to 63, but her life, according to the sparse records Margaret could find, had been marked by recurrent mental health issues and 3 failed marriages. Her brother James had died at age 42 in a drowning accident, despite being an excellent swimmer. Both parents had died within a year of each other in 1925, Thomas from heart failure and Eleanor from what was listed as nervous exhaustion. Margaret received an email notification, a response to an inquiry she'd sent to a folklore professor at Yale who specialized in photographic anomalies and spiritualist history. Dr. Helen Vance asked if they could meet that afternoon to discuss the Morrison photograph. They met at a cafe near Yale's campus. Dr. Vance was a woman in her 50s with intense dark eyes and an air of scholarly intensity. She examined the Morrison photograph on Margaret's laptop with great interest. Remarkable, Dr. Vance said. I've been studying photographic anomalies for 20 years, and this is one of the clearest examples I've seen. The hand is in perfect focus, properly lit, correctly positioned in three-dimensional space, and yet it cannot exist according to the laws of physics as we understand them. Do you believe it's supernatural? Margaret asked directly. Dr. Vance considered the question carefully. I believe that photography, in its early decades, captured things we don't fully understand. The technology was new, mysterious to most people. Some theorists believe that cameras, being mechanical and objective, could record aspects of reality that human perception filters out. Others argue that these are simply defects, chemical irregularities that our pattern-seeking brains interpret as meaningful. But you've seen other cases like this? Many. And here's what's interesting. They cluster around certain locations and certain photographers. Samuel Blackwood, who took this photograph, had at least a dozen similar cases. William Mumler, the famous spirit photographer in Boston, hundreds more, though many of those were proven frauds. But not all. Some defy explanation. Dr. Vance opened her own laptop and showed Margaret photographs from her research collection. Image after image of families, individuals, children, and in each one, some detail that shouldn't exist. A hand, a face, a shadow, a figure in the background. I call it the collector phenomenon, Dr. Vance explained, because when you map these cases geographically and chronologically, they seem to follow patterns, as if something is moving through space and time, appearing in photographs, choosing subjects. And those subjects, like Catherine Morrison, often report feeling watched, followed, claimed by something they encountered through these spiritualist practices. Catherine wrote that the entity collects people who are touched in photographs, Margaret said, that it preserves them in moments of time. Dr. Vance's eyes widened. You have writings from Catherine Morrison. I've been trying to locate her descendants for years. Her case is central to my research. Margaret shared the memoir excerpts and, after some hesitation, the impossible letter. Dr. Vance read everything with growing excitement, and Margaret noticed a hint of fear. If this letter is authentic, and we'd need to test the paper and ink to be sure, then it suggests something extraordinary, Dr. Vance said slowly. It suggests that the phenomenon doesn't end with death, that whatever Catherine encountered, it remained connected to her after her death, perhaps even enabled her to send this warning. Or someone faked the letter to perpetuate a ghost story, Margaret countered, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. Possibly. But consider this. Every subject I've studied who appeared in these anomalous photographs reported the same experience Catherine described, a sense of being watched, of something standing behind them, of a hand on their shoulder, and several left written warnings to their descendants about destroying the photographs. They understood, or believed they understood, that these images were dangerous, that they served as anchors or doorways for something. Dr. Vance pulled up another image on her laptop, a photograph from 1878 showing a family in New York. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a full figure, a woman in Victorian dress. This is the earliest example I've found, the Merriweather family. The mother had been conducting seances to contact her deceased father. Within 5 years of this photograph, all 4 people in the image had died under unusual circumstances. You're saying the photographs kill people? I'm saying there's a correlation between appearing in these photographs and suffering misfortune. Whether that's causation, coincidence, or something else entirely, I don't know. What I do know is that the phenomenon is real, documented across multiple decades and locations, and it's centered around families involved in spiritualism. Margaret felt a chill despite the warm cafe. What should I do with the Morrison photograph? That depends on what you believe, Dr. Vance said. If you think it's just an interesting historical curiosity with an explanation we haven't found yet, then preserve it, Document it, share it with researchers. But if you believe Catherine's warning, she paused, then perhaps you should consider destroying it. Yeah, wouldn't that be destroying historical evidence? Would it? Or would it be releasing whatever connection that photograph maintains? Dr. Vance leaned forward. Here's what I've learned. These photographs don't age normally. The images seem to shift slightly over time, as if they're alive in some way. And people who spend too much time studying them report experiences similar to what Catherine described, feeling watched, followed, touched by invisible hands. Margaret thought about the way the hand had seemed more solid, more prominent each time she looked at it. She'd attributed it to her imagination, but what if it wasn't? Have you experienced anything like that? Dr. Vance asked. Margaret wanted to say no, but honesty compelled her to admit, I felt cold when I'm near the photograph. And last night I thought I saw movement in the shadows behind the family, but I was tired. It was dark. Classic experiences, Dr. Vance interrupted. Almost everyone who studies these photographs reports similar phenomena. My advice, document everything, make copies, share your research. But then get rid of the original. Don't let it remain in your possession. Margaret left the meeting with more questions than answers. She drove back to her grandmother's house as afternoon shadows lengthened into evening. The house felt different now, colder, as if something in it had changed. She went straight to the study where she'd been working and opened her laptop to back up all her research files. As the files copied, she looked at the Morrison photograph, which she'd left on the desk. The hand on Catherine's shoulder was definitely darker now, more defined. Or was she just convincing herself of that because of everything she'd learned? Margaret picked up the photograph to store it away safely. As she did, she felt something. A pressure on her own shoulder, cold and heavy, exactly as Catherine had described. She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. She set the photograph down quickly and stepped back, her breath coming in short gasps. This was ridiculous. She was letting fear and suggestion override her rational mind. There was nothing supernatural about this situation. There was an explanation for everything. She just hadn't found it yet. But as she stood there in the fading light, watching the portrait from across the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her back. That the hand in the photograph wasn't just an image frozen in time, it was reaching forward through the decades, looking for someone new to touch. And in that moment, Margaret understood why her grandmother had kept the photograph hidden in the attic for so many years. 3 days had passed since Margaret's meeting with Dr. Vance, and the Morrison photograph sat on her desk, carefully positioned under a bright lamp. She'd spent those days documenting every detail, creating high-resolution scans and cataloging her research findings. Now she had to make a decision. Her rational mind argued for preservation. This was history, evidence of something extraordinary, whether supernatural or simply an unexplained photographic phenomenon. Destroying it would be a loss to scholarship, to understanding. But another part of her, the part that woke at 3 a.m. feeling that cold weight on her shoulder, argued for Catherine's solution. Destroy it. End whatever connection it maintained. Margaret had continued her research, driven by an almost obsessive need to understand. She'd discovered that Samuel Blackwood's studio had burned down in 1914, 2 years after he'd closed it. The fire had been ruled accidental, but witness reports described Blackwood deliberately setting the blaze, standing in front of the building and saying, "Let it all burn. Let them all burn." He died by suicide a year later. She'd also found that the house where the Morrisons had lived in Hartford had been demolished in 1978 after sitting vacant for 3 years. The official reason was structural damage, but Margaret found a letter to the City Planning Board from the last owner, written in 1975. "I have tried to maintain this property, but no tenant will remain more than a few months. They all report the same experiences. Footsteps in empty rooms, cold spots, and the persistent feeling of being watched. I believe this house is cursed. and I request permission to demolish it." Every thread she pulled led to the same conclusion. Something about the Morrison family's experience with spiritualism had created or attracted something that persisted across time, visible in photographs, felt by the living. Margaret's phone rang, breaking her concentration. It was Dr. Vance. "I've been analyzing the digital copies you sent me," Dr. Vance said without preamble. "I had a colleague in digital forensics examine them. Margaret, the hand in your most recent scan is 3% larger and 17% darker than in the scan you took 4 days ago. The photograph is changing." Margaret felt her heart sink. "That's impossible. Physical photographs don't change. Normal photographs don't, but as I told you, these aren't normal. They're anchors, connections to something that exists outside normal time. The longer you keep it, the stronger the connection becomes. You need to destroy it. Today. But if I destroy it, we lose the evidence, all the research. You've documented everything, that's enough. The original needs to be released." "Released? You make it sound like something's trapped in it." "Maybe something is. Or maybe the photograph is trapping whoever looks at it. Either way, you've done the research, you've preserved the information. Now protect yourself." After the call ended, Margaret sat in silence. She looked at the Morrison family, at Thomas and Eleanor's serious faces, at young James, standing straight and proper, and at Catherine, whose eyes seemed to hold a warning even across 115 years. And she looked at the hand. It definitely appeared larger now, more solid. She could almost see the texture of the skin, the lines in the palm. She picked up the magnifying glass and examined it closely. Behind the hand, in the background shadow, the face she'd noticed before was clearer now. A woman's face with hollow eyes, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at her. Margaret set down the magnifying glass with shaking hands. Dr. Vance was right. Whatever this was, it was growing stronger, feeding on attention, on study, on the focused observation of researchers like herself. She thought about Catherine Morrison, living 63 years with that presence, feeling that hand on her shoulder every day. She thought about the 17 other cases she'd documented, the premature deaths, the mental anguish, the families destroyed by something they'd inadvertently invited in through their grief and desperate need to contact the dead. Eleanor Morrison had lost her sister and couldn't accept that loss. She'd sought connection with the dead and found something willing to pretend, willing to masquerade as her beloved sister. Something that wanted access to the living world, that needed to be invited in, acknowledged, photographed, made real through the mechanical eye of the camera. And once it was photographed, it had a permanent anchor, a doorway that could never fully close. Margaret made her decision. She gathered the photograph, the frame, and all the physical documents related to it. She took them to the backyard, where an old metal fire pit sat among overgrown grass. She'd already backed up all her digital files, shared her research with Dr. Vance and the Connecticut Historical Society. The information would survive, but the anchor needed to be destroyed. She placed the photograph in the fire pit and struck a match. As the flame touched the corner of the old paper, she felt a sudden, intense cold, as if the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in an instant. The pressure on her shoulder returned, heavier than before, almost painful. Margaret stepped back, watching as the flames consumed the photograph. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a sound like wind or a distant voice, but it was probably just the fire crackling. The photograph curled and blackened, the Morrison family's faces disappearing into ash. The hand was the last thing to burn, seeming to resist the flames before finally crumbling into nothing. The cold pressure on her shoulder vanished. The air felt normal again. Margaret stood there for a long time, watching the ashes scatter in the evening breeze. Had she just destroyed valuable historical evidence? Or had she released something that had been trapped for over a century? Had she protected herself from a dangerous phenomenon, or simply given in to superstitious fear? She would never know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty was the point. The Morrison photograph had existed in the space between explanation and mystery, between the rational and the inexplicable. Some questions didn't have answers. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Margaret went back inside and sat at her desk, looking at the digital copy still on her laptop screen. The hand was visible, frozen in pixels, but somehow it seemed less threatening now. Just an image, just data, without the weight and presence of the original. She wrote up her findings, a comprehensive report documenting everything she'd learned about the Morrison family, Samuel Blackwood, and the phenomenon of anomalous spirit photography. She sent copies to research institutions, paranormal archives, and historical societies. The information would survive, available to anyone who wanted to study it. But the original photograph, the anchor, the doorway, that was gone. As Margaret prepared to leave her grandmother's house, having completed her task of sorting through the estate, she took one last look at the attic. The corner where she'd found the Morrison photograph was empty now, just dust and shadows. She wondered if her grandmother had known what the photograph contained. Had she kept it hidden deliberately, knowing it was dangerous? Or had she simply tucked away an old family portrait without understanding its significance? Margaret would never know that either. Some secrets went to the grave, and perhaps that was where they belonged. As she drove away from the house, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Margaret caught a glimpse of something in her rearview mirror. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the attic window, a woman's silhouette backlit by the dying light. But when she looked again, the window was empty. Just her imagination, she told herself. Just the power of suggestion after days of immersing herself in stories of spirits and photographs. She turned her eyes back to the road ahead and didn't look back again. The Morrison photograph was gone, but its story would remain, a reminder that some mysteries exist in the spaces between what we can see and what we can understand, between the living and the dead, between the captured moment and the eternal present. And somewhere, in those shadows between, perhaps Catherine Morrison and all the others touched by photographs could finally rest, released from the hand that had claimed them so long ago. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the phenomenon continued, waiting for the next grieving family to open a door they couldn't close, for the next camera to capture what shouldn't exist, for the next hand to reach across the boundary between worlds. Margaret didn't know. And she had decided she didn't want to know. Some mysteries she had learned were better left unexplored. The Morrison photograph raises questions we may never fully answer. Was it a genuine supernatural phenomenon, a photographic anomaly we don't yet understand, or a case of suggestion and belief manifesting across generations? The evidence suggests something extraordinary occurred in that Hartford studio in 1910. Something that defied explanation and haunted a family for decades. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have destroyed the photograph or preserved it for further study? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts on this mysterious case. If you enjoyed this investigation into one of photography's most unsettling mysteries, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future explorations of the unexplained. Your support helps me continue bringing you these fascinating stories. Until next time, remember, not everything captured by the camera is meant to be seen, and some images once seen are impossible to forget.